A few minutes ago, any little move in a Category 4 storm like this, as it approaches the coast, can make a very big difference. We're watching Milton, watching it minute by minute as it bears down on the west coast of Florida. And our Newsnation station in the Tampa area, WFLA, has what it calls a wobble tracker. So what that does is it takes a look at the storm as it's coming in to the coast. This is the track of the storm. This is from the National Hurricane Center, actually 130 miles an hour. And any little movement in it, they have a line on it, and if it moves to the south a little bit, moves to the north a little bit, you're going to have a much different result in terms of storm surge. I want to see what Mr. G thinks of all of this, meteorologist at Pix 11 News, which is our Newsnation station here in New York. Hello, G.
That's a new technology.
Right. The wobble thing, right?
The wobble thing. I want to talk.
Well, give me a second to introduce Paul, for goodness sake. Paul Rykoff was our regular guest. This is The Wobble, host of the Independent Americans podcast. This is the wobble tracker that FLA is using. Right. I was watching it all day. It's that red line. Any little move, right? 10, 15, 20 miles. Go ahead.
Yeah, here's the deal with the wobble. First of all, the winds are now 130, as you noted. It's north and east 16 miles per hour. As the storm picks up speed, the wobble factor becomes less.
Interesting.
Now, the track for landfall would be Tampa right now with this slight bend to the north and picking up speed. The wobble straightens out. If that holds true, that's a real problem.
That's a real problem for Tampa, because to me it looks like that looks a lot like Sarasota. But you're saying that's the bottom end of the storm.
Yes.
And the flooding. Someone was saying earlier, maybe you could explain this, like the front, I think they said front right quadrant is where, and wherever that hits, then the flooding kind of comes up from there, the storm surge, right?
And what they call the dirty quadrant. And you can see the outer band there, and there's a break period, but the outer band has what's called spinners, and the spinners of the tornadic activity, which you noted before, is breaking out all over the place. Yeah. Now, what's really interesting is got to get away from the diminishing winds to note that when great hurricanes weaken, the tropical force wind expands, the rainfall expands, the eye expands. That means, figure 2 days ago, the tropical force winds extended out 80 miles. Yep. Right now, they're over 300 miles.
Crazy.
The hurricane force winds extended out 30 miles. By the time it approaches land, it will go 60 miles. And the punch, and the real gut punch, I think, is going to come right in the center of the peninsula, because that's where the heftiest rains are going to deluge that area.
Like Orlando or...
Yes, but there's a little bit of a bright spot here, if you can call it that. As this picks up speed, the faster the blast, the faster it passes. That's a weather expression. So you want this thing to pick up speed, so the rain amounts would be a little bit less.
Get out in a hurry if you can. All right, now let's talk. Paul's here focused on the response, so let's talk about that for a few minutes. And the sheriff was saying this earlier, but there's there's a lot of factors, right? So we've talked about it could be the actual military, the National Guard, some of these private groups. This is, to Mr. G's point, a big one, and it's going to be all hands on deck right after Helene. I mean, we haven't, this back-to-back nature of it makes the response really tough.
First of all, it's an honor to be sitting up here with Mr. G. I grew up watching him, and I feel like I'm sitting next to the professor, so I'm honored to be with him.
The great Mr. G.
But I also think what folks need to know is that helpers are staging right now, and our national security apparatus, our National Guard, our active duty military are staged, are already going in, and when folks are running out, they're going in. So you've got over 7,000 National Guard have already been deployed. You got about 1,500 active duty from the 82nd and 101st that already went into North Carolina and that region, and they're staging all around the country to provide help. So for folks that are down there, hang in there. The National Guard will be coming, the active duty will be coming, and a lot of civilian response groups like Team Rubicon, which
they do great work, right?
Amazing, inspiring group of veterans who are a disaster response group who run into every disaster. They've been doing it for over a decade around the world, and they're staging right now to go in as others are headed out.
I had a guy on yesterday from one of the other groups. He says they just got back from Beirut. They go from disaster to disaster, right? And now, we'll see how this one, does it strike, we have the word catastrophic up there. This one, it just feels like it's going to be tough for this to miss being a really bad one at this point.
And for all of us, there's an emotional component to this storm. We have friends down there. We have family down there. Everybody knows everybody on the east and west coast of Florida. And when we keep using these words, obviously, we're trying to let the public know we've never seen anything like this. So when you're talking about a surge that's twice as tall as I am or you are, That's a big deal. Cars flying in the air like a projectile. That's a big deal. So I just want to know what you were talking about in terms of the response. When it's fast and the storm is fast, then if the location of the surge is there, that makes your response a little easier because you know exactly where the help is needed.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also important to know that there are active duty military bases in that area, too. You've got Special Operations Command outside of Tampa. So they've got to move assets out of the storm to be able to respond to other things.
Right in Tampa Bay.
Yeah, throughout that area. Throughout Florida, you've got a lot of Navy assets down there that are going to have to be moved and staged. But they're also ready to respond. I mean, I always think about the old saying from Mr. Rogers, when things are bad, look for the helpers. Yeah. There are helpers that are going in. And this country is so divided right now. This might be the kind of thing that brings us together. This is a time that could be a gut punch, but we can respond as Republicans, Democrats, and independents come together and take care of our own.
I mean, it's been politicized the last few days, which we could talk about later, I guess. But I hope you're right this time. Because
now's the time to put the political guns down, pick up a shovel, help your neighbors, and get to work.
You know, just one final point.
Yes.
Paul and I were talking. We're going to have to change the way we do business in years to come because the flood stages are going up. All right, the surges are going up. The walls are not high enough. The responses are always the same. They build beach houses again. They rehab houses again. Yeah. But now the insurance companies are not paying for it. So there's going to have to be a kind of reboot here with hurricane after hurricane. Inside of 3 weeks, there's going to have to be, I think, a new plan.
A new plan, a new way of looking at it. Climate change plays into that. All of these things that we need to talk more about play into that. Thank you, Mr. G. Thank Paul staying with us as our coverage continues here. We take a quick break on Hurricane Milton. President Biden today calling out former President Trump and also the Republican Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, by name. He says that they've been spreading misinformation. So let's talk about that and, you know, how political this hurricane and these storms have become as we welcome in May Melman. May's a former White House Associate Counsel in the Trump administration. We also have Newsnation contributor Kurt Bardella with us. Kurt's a Democratic strategist, and Paul's still here. Paul Rykoff is here in studio with me as well. May, why don't you take that first? I mean, the president, the vice president have been trying to get out ahead of this the last few days. They said a lot of the stuff Trump's been saying, whether it was about the first storm or about this one, is simply misinformation. And you say what?
I say that looking at the federal government's response is certainly not something new under the sun. If we look at everything from Hurricane Katrina to COVID, right? There used to be a death tracker on every news outlet at the time, totally politicizing COVID. So I don't think that this is something new. I don't think that this is something particularly shocking. And I do think that there are real questions about FEMA's response to sparsely populated areas in Western North Carolina.
Right. I think it was the specific issues. You bring up stuff like, oh, they're only getting $750. We know that's just a start. That's not what they're only getting. Things like that. Talking about the migrants, Kurt, as well. We know that's a different pool of money, maybe FEMA money, but it's not the same pool of money. So that type of stuff, again, the Democrats say it's dangerous. And what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, looking at federal government response to disasters after the fact, what could have been done better? How could it have worked better? How can we make sure that resources get to those who need it most as soon as possible? That's all fine and well. We've had that time and again, and that's what should happen. We should always be evaluating whether or not we can do better. But to do so beforehand, to start spreading things that just frankly aren't true and making up stuff to score cheap political points amidst a major disaster, it's disgusting. It's despicable. It's wrong. For someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a congresswoman who sits on the oversight committee that oversees the federal government, to go out there and just make insane things up that they, whoever they are, controls the weather. Like, if we can't get to a place where everyone universally that has a functioning brain says, yeah, that's absolute nonsense, let's move on. If we can't get people just to do that much, we have a real problem here. The federal government right now is operating, I think, incredibly efficiently. They have reached out and had direct contact with elected officials of both parties, state leaders of Republicans and Democrats. Those elected officials have said so. They have said as much that they have had direct touch points with the president and with FEMA. We have more than I think they just put out a notice saying there are more than 8,000 federal personnel on the ground across the Southeast right now. We've already had more than $344 million in assistance has been provided to Hurricane Helene survivors. What more could you want from the federal government right now?
Okay, let's talk. Paul, I think you were saying something similar before, but add to that, and then I want to get to the campaign for a minute, which does continue, by the way, even with the storm. So your take on this topic first.
Unsurprisingly, as the independent, I'm going to split the difference here.
Okay.
I mean, yes, there is a need for accountability. And despite what Kurt says, I think we can do better. We can do more. We've seen that from people
we
on
always
the ground.
can, right? These
Always,
storms.
absolutely. And you also need accountability. That's always required before, during, and after. But we also don't need to spread misinformation. Truth is essential here, putting out good information so people can survive. We have to treat this essentially like a combat scenario. People's lives are in the balance, and it's a time to put misinformation out of the way, focus on facts, and at least try to bring the two parties together to focus on a common enemy, which is literally a storm bearing down on our country.
Or two storms in less than 2 weeks.
This is where our politics fails us, and they have to find ways to come together, provide good information, adequate responses, and show, frankly, that the government and the country can work and respond to a legitimate crisis that has people's lives in jeopardy.
Let me get a word or two in on the actual campaign today as we're covering the storm so closely. May the former president is in Scranton right now, and he's holding this event in Joe Biden's hometown, right, Scranton, Pennsylvania. There he is. All of the numbers show, all of them, that this is the key state. In fact, I was looking at some data this morning. If you win Pennsylvania, whoever, if you're Trump or if you're Harris, you have like a better than 80% chance of being president. It's close to 85. That's our metrics. So this is it. What about Trump in Pennsylvania, May?
Yeah, so I think if you were to just look at polling, I'm heartened as a Republican. If you compare, Clinton at this point was up 9.5 points, Biden was up 7 points, and now the Real Clear Politics average has Trump barely up, so basically tied.
Right.
So just the polling, I think, should give Republicans comfort. But it's not just polling, right? It's the get out the vote effort. And even there are more Democrats registered than Republicans, but the gap is as small as it's ever been since they've tracked these numbers. So there are more gettable votes. So I think the trend, I feel positive as a Republican, but there's so much uncertainty with the get out the vote.
That's interesting. Kurt, I'll come to you last for the last word on this. Paul, on that, May brings up the kind of the registrations in Pennsylvania is interesting. It was a huge advantage for Democrats a couple of cycles ago, and it's not as big of one now. And again, that's the key state, and Trump can win there. I don't know if he will, but he can.
And as always, independents are being underestimated and underreported, and that could be the X factor here in part because if you register at the DMV now in Pennsylvania, you're opted in to vote, and many people who are opting in for the first time are registering as unaffiliated and independent. Right. They're not showing up in polling. 60% of young people are unaffiliated. So the short answer is we don't know. Every time we go into an election cycle, it's going to be different, and it's especially going to be disrupted and influenced and maybe determined by the independents who are going to sway this election in Pennsylvania and probably in other key swing states as well.
So the challenge for Harris and Kurt is to, and this is why a place like Scranton is important, and we've looked at this a little bit, blue-collar workers, she's had some issues in the data, right? So is she slipping a little bit? Over the last month or so, the momentum that she has in the data slipped just a little. She probably, if she has an advantage now, it's a smaller one than she had about a month ago, and that might be one of the reasons why. Not just Pennsylvania, but also Wisconsin and Michigan. How do you see it?
Well, I look at more deeper into the polls, whereas the national average has her up 16 points with independents when you take the aggregate of all the national polls right now in the swing states. And so she is doing better with independents than you might think when you look at the surface numbers that show a neck and neck race. I think everybody agrees, like, regardless of who you're rooting for, everything is pretty much within the error margin. When you dive into the crosstabs of these things, she does have an advantage with women. She does have an advantage with independents. And as we've seen over the last couple of election cycles, those voters have been moving more towards Democrats as Republicans have gotten a little too extreme for the mainstream, particularly when it comes to women's issues and abortion. That was one of the driving forces in why the red wave never materialized in the midterms, why in Pennsylvania we've seen Josh Shapiro win the governorship, John Fetterman win the Senate. Yeah. Pennsylvania has been good for Democrats so far because of those things.
Trump's won there before. Can he win there again? I don't know. It should be a slight advantage Democrat, but it's very, very close lately, especially the last couple of weeks. Thank you, May. Thank you, Kurt. And Paul, as always, we appreciate it. Now, President